Senator Tuberville is still just as against the DoD policy that prompted his protest, which is about providing travel reimbursements for service members or dependents who have to travel out of state for an abortion or any other non-covered reproductive health care procedure. DoD maintains that that policy is not only legally sound as decided by the DOJ, but that it's also necessary for military readiness because from a DoD perspective, they say these service members, regardless of where they're stationed across the United States, should have equal access to health care regardless of where they live. Now we know since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, individual states have passed more restrictive laws. So this is really making sure a service member has the same access to, let's say, an abortion in Alabama as they would in New York.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, we've seen a breakthrough of sorts in Senator Tommy Tuberville's holds on military promotions and confirmations. What can you tell us about what and who has gotten through, but also where the sticking points remain?
A good place to start is that the Senate voted to confirm 3 of their top generals to their positions this week. They voted to confirm General Charles Q. Brown Jr. to be the next Joint Chief of Staff. Mm-hmm. He will assume that position later next week. They also voted to confirm General Randy George to be the next Army Chief of Staff. He was serving in that position in an interim capacity due to Senator Tuberville's hold. Now that now that they voted on it, he passed. The Army Secretary has now sworn him in, and he's now in that role officially. Mm-hmm. And then they also did it with the Marine Corps Commandant, General Eric Smith. He was also serving in that role in an interim capacity until he could be voted on and then confirmed. That has also happened. They've only voted on these 3 generals, and they still have more than 315 promotions and nominations that haven't been voted on. Right. And so this really all started this week because Senator Tuberville was going to go through the procedural requirements to bring these votes to the floor himself. Right. And then Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer sort of cut him off in that respect and did it himself. Mm-hmm. And so we've only seen votes on these 3, and it's not clear yet exactly what's going to happen with the other 315 that are still outstanding and up for, should be up for a vote.
Right.
That being said, we don't know not only what will happen next, but also part of the reason that is because neither side has shown any interest in actually changing their stance.
Sure.
Senator Tuberville is still just as against the DoD policy that prompted his protest, which is about providing travel reimbursements for service members or dependents who have to travel out of state for an abortion or any other non-covered reproductive health care procedure. DoD maintains that that policy is not only legally sound as decided by the DOJ, but that it's also necessary for military readiness because from a DoD perspective, they say these service members, regardless of where they're stationed across the United States, should have equal access to health care regardless of where they live. Now we know since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, individual states have passed more restrictive laws. So this is really making sure a service member has the same access to, let's say, an abortion in Alabama as they would in New York.
Mm-hmm. And so, as you say, the abortion travel reimbursement policy hasn't changed. And there are all of these nominees and promotions that are still stuck in limbo. But Tuberville did strike a little bit of a point because Schumer never really wanted to do any of these individual confirmations. 1, because he didn't want to set the precedent, and 2, because it will be time consuming if that has to be the way that everybody gets through. But on these 3, they're at least robbed the talking point a little bit, no?
They did. And so just so viewers understand, despite Senator Tuberville's hold, Senator Schumer, as the majority leader, had the ability to bring any individual of these 300, roughly 20 nominations to the floor for an individual vote that Senator Tuberville wouldn't be able to stop. Mm-hmm. And so he did force Schumer's hand in this respect, because had Senator Tuberville not gone through these procedural steps or said he would, these votes likely wouldn't have happened. So this really was...
And Tuberville did end up voting for all three of these nominees.
Yes. And so this really was a minor but somewhat of a win for Senator Tuberville in that, he had maintained that this, Senator Schumer had a workaround. And so he proved that Senator Schumer did have a workaround. That being said, as you mentioned, neither side is closer to actually coming to some sort of agreement or compromise on what should happen with this policy. And while there are 300 plus nominations still outstanding, DOD says there will be another 300 that will need a vote by the end of the year.
So Mr. Zelensky has come to Washington once again. So the Ukrainian president has visited both members of Congress and President Joe Biden. What was on the agenda?
So prior to President Zelensky coming to D.C., he was also in New York at the United Nations General Assembly, where he gave a speech imploring world leaders to stand behind Ukraine as the war continues. And so we've seen, we're now 19 months into the war. We're seeing in D.C. Some internal struggle within the Republican Party about whether to continue supporting aid to Ukraine. And President Zelensky's trip was really timed, not necessarily intentionally, but with the showing of these fractures within Congress. Right. And so while we saw President Zelensky go to the White House and to the Pentagon and hear messages of longstanding support, we didn't quite see that from Zelensky's trip to Capitol Hill. He met with the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, but they didn't allow photographers in. Right. There have been reports that the Speaker did not allow President Zelensky to address a full, the full body of Congress.
Right.
And so it shows that we're seeing the government on the precipice of a shutdown due to again internal struggles within the GOP about whether to support a continuing resolution to continue funding the government. But we've also seen a pocket of Republicans who say they're not willing to sign any sort of funding for government if it includes aid to Ukraine. And so while there is a section of the Republican Party that wants to continue supporting aid, right. Zelensky's trip was really timed coincidentally with this pretty public display of dispute within the party.
At the present moment, this is all in a state of flux because there's a lot of disagreement and these spending bills are being renegotiated really as we speak. But at present, as we're taping this, the House version of a temporary spending bill would not include the Ukraine aid.
Right now, that's where things stand. We don't know exactly what will play out. We also saw the administration today release its latest aid package for about $300 million. It included somewhat controversially cluster munitions, which is something that the U.S. has provided once before, but there are literally over 100 countries across the globe that have banned these specific type of munitions for the dangers that they pose to civilians. And while the administration provided them to Ukraine back in July, they actually hadn't done so in its couple most recent aid packages.
And the Biden administration is under some pressure from some quarters of Capitol Hill to define what victory looks like in Ukraine.
That's exactly right. We've heard from a group of Republicans on Capitol Hill who have reached out to the White House with some very pointed questions about the administration's goals in Ukraine. Whether, what does success look like? What does winning look like? How long will this aid continue? Is this another, forever war?
Right.
And so it's not quite clear how these, what the answers are to these questions from the administration's perspective. But we've also seen, a push from some Democrats and a few Republicans to give Ukraine long-range missiles, specifically called ATACMS. And these weapons would give Ukraine the ability to hit targets within Russian-occupied Crimea as well as within Russian proper. Now, that's been one of the biggest sticking points the administration has tried to avoid, which is not enabling strikes within Russian territory because they don't want Russia to accuse them of escalating the war and this become, spilling further, further
ensnaring NATO in the war.
And so it's unclear exactly, whether or not the administration will provide ATACMS. We've heard they're still on the table, even though they weren't included in this package. But it's unclear, if the administration were to provide them, when they would even get there.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at WashingtonExaminer.com.